Well, hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Christina, and on behalf of myosh, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us for the third and final part of our powerful series with Cristian from HabitSafe. Now, today's session is titled Human Factors That Disrupt Our Subconscious Conscious Interplay. And it's going to bring everything we've discussed so far together in a really meaningful way. Now, we've already learned how the autopilot conscious interplay drives most of our day-to-day behaviour and how tapping into this understanding can make us safer. But today we go that one step further. Today we're looking at what happens when stress, frustration, fatigue, and other human factors override that interplay, pushing different neural circuits into control and leading us to behaviours we sometimes regret. And it's really powerful stuff. Cristian will share how neuroscience gives us new tools to manage these moments and improve real-world safety outcomes. Now, our biggest thing we want you to remember is to stay engaged throughout. Please drop your thoughts and your questions in the chat box. We absolutely love hearing from you. And if we don't get to everything today, we're actually going to have a follow-up session on Tuesday next week. So if you have any specific questions, please pop them in there or send them through to us, and we can get to them either today or if not next week. Now, let's get into it, and please welcome back Cristian from HabitSafe.
Thanks very much, Christina. So look, I always start the sessions with a warning, I guess, that I have a reputation for thinking about things differently. I like science, and the reason why I mention that is because I've seen lots of different approaches to safety, and I've always followed where the evidence leads, which sometimes is not exactly where safety goes. So today, I'm going to show you the evidence for managing stress and fatigue, the main human factor disruptors of that autoplay conscious mind, autopilot conscious mind interplay that Christina mentioned. So in previous webinars, we defined the problem as safety performance is staggering. Now that graph there is the workplace fatalities in Australia. And as you can see, not really a lot has happened since 2013. And for the first time in 10 years, in 2024, we actually got to 200. Before then, it was a little bit less than that. And there are a couple of low numbers there, like 2018 and 2021. Now, that graph is not just something that happens in Australia. It happens in all sorts of different developed economies around the world. And the graph I've just shown you there is the one for the US. Looks pretty much the same, numbers are a little bit higher. And although today we do more for safety and we do it better than ever before, these graphs keep this sort of stagnating safety performance sort of happening. So the question that we asked is, what are we missing that's important? And it's a question that we asked in about 2010 or soon afterwards, because we couldn't really understand why the stagnation started to happen, because it started to happen just before 2010, but since then it's really kind of governed the way that things are. So if you remember from webinar 1, we looked at 3 main brain myths that are holding us back. The first one was that knowledge is enough to do things safely. So we assume that if people know what will hurt them and the controls that they need to have in place, they will avoid having an incident. Now, that's not true 100% of the time, because knowledge tends to serve the people that don't know. We did a study of about a few more than 200 safety incidents, and in less than 2% did the person not know about the hazard or not know about the control. More disturbingly is that in more than 95% of the incidents, there was a corrective action that involved either training, retraining, or refresher training. So although people knew, it tends to be one of the go-to things that organisations do when there's an incident. Obviously, their view is that the person either didn't know or temporarily forgot. I don't think that's what's happening, but that's what we saw. The second brain myth is people can consciously control their safety. And we assume that because safety is important, people should be able to keep it front of mind. Well, unfortunately, that's not how the brain works. The conscious mind gets involved when things are new or different. but most things that we do are familiar. And the discoveries of neuroscience show that most of what we do is subconsciously driven, and it's difficult to get the conscious mind involved, even if it involves our safety. And the third one is we can't do anything about inattention. Now, there's plenty of science that shows that most inattention is avoidable, but we need to be able to work with the subconscious in order to make it happen. Unfortunately, when it comes to behavior and trying to deal with inattention and human error, most of the work that we've done is with the conscious mind. And surprise, surprise, it hasn't really worked that well. So in safety, the three brain myths have resulted in an over-reliance on the safety system. To put it bluntly, sometimes there's too much paperwork. And when the paperwork becomes a burden, most of it gets done as a tick and flick exercise, and it really loses its value. The other thing that it's resulted in is a focus on conversations about the importance of safety in order to put it front of mind. Now, we know from Brain Myth 2 that people cannot consciously control their safety. So when we realized that, we had a choice. We can either get some information and get better at understanding what drives behavior and how do we get people to be safer, or we can throw our hands up in the air and say, hey, it all happens in people's heads, there's nothing we can do. Now in safety, I think collectively, we went down the path of option 2. And of course, that only leaves us with, we can only do things around the worker, which is something that gets bandied around a fair bit in safety these days. Now, from our perspective, we think a safety system is good to do. We think that conversing with people about the importance of safety is good to do, and certainly doing things around the worker is also good to do. But if you look at the data, it can't be all we do, because that's not really having much of an impact. So the question really is, what else do we need to do? And we think that we also need to use the discoveries of neuroscience to help people deal with the subconscious brain modes. And what I'm talking about that, if you've seen the previous webinars, it's about autopilot, complacency, inattentive habits. It's about fatigue, and it's about stress. So the second webinar, as Christina mentioned, was about most human behavior is a battle for control between two brain modes, autopilot, or if you like, inattentive habits and complacency, because most of the things within autopilot we do with inattentive habits and we tend to see it as complacent, and conscious control. Now, both of these minds are working all the time. It's just that only one of them can have control over behavior. And autopilot, which is the mode that we use when things are familiar, tends to be in play 95% of the time. Conscious control, when it's in play when something is new or different, tends to be in play about 5% of the time. So this translates to two types of inattention. The first one is top down. And what I mean by that is that we consciously control it. So it can be directed to help us achieve our goals. Because we're aware of it and can direct it, we think that is all we have. But there is also bottom-up attention. And that's driven subconsciously via our habits. And that can make us attentive towards what can hurt us or inattentive towards what can hurt us. And what we know is that it underpins the vast majority of our safety, and we're not even aware of it. So as Albert Einstein said, we cannot solve problems with the same thinking we use to create them. And that's why I always go back to science, because science makes you question everything that you do and look for evidence. And sometimes, the evidence is there, and if you follow it, you get to a better place than if you just rely on people's opinions or what they've always done. So what do? So we use neuroscience to prevent incidents, improve engagement, and move safety culture forward by, firstly, is teaching people how to detect and be on guard against the causes of avoidable inattention. And there are three: autopilot, stress, and fatigue. We help people build attentive habits so they can prevent incidents, and we spoke about that in the second webinar. And we also want to do this for the long term. So we work with leaders to ensure long-term sustainability. Because if you don't keep pat these things, essentially what happens is people migrate back to their old habits, which then they tend to be habits that are full of inattention. So when we have an experience our brain interprets it based on, firstly, what makes intuitive sense. So this is emotional, subconscious, we're not aware of it. It's got to do with these automatic patterns of response that I've spoken about before, and they're invisible to us. And the things that we like are things like familiarity, consistency with peers' views, that make us feel good, all that kind of stuff. So that is the first step. Now, what we tend to do secondly is use our conscious mind to create a story to justify whatever we've chosen intuitively in the first place. And thirdly, if this happens at all, we look at facts. But if we do look at facts, we tend to only consider those that validate our interpretation. If they don't validate our interpretation, we find a reason why not to look at it. Now, people think that perhaps maybe this three-step process just applies to workers. Well, in my experience, it applies just as much to management and to safety professionals as well. And people in safety tend to be reluctant to use the discoveries of neuroscience because, for 50 years, we have done three things. We've eliminated hazards, fixed controls, and tried to get people to keep safety front of mind. Now, these approaches are familiar and we feel comfortable with them. So they're like that old pair of slippers that you have at home that may not be in the best state, but they feel really comfortable. Now, the safety data leaves us with a choice. We can either continue to wear, the old slippers, do the things that we've always done and just say to ourselves, look, I'm sorry, but that's as good as it gets. Or we can think about what are we missing, look for a better understanding in order to be able to influence safety. And that really is a new pair of slippers. They may not be comfy at first, but they'll serve us a lot better in the long term. So neuroscience, and there's plenty of neurosciences of this, shows that up to 95% of what we do originates in the subconscious. So up to 95% of what we do originates in a place that we're not aware of, which begs the question, what drives what we do? And there we are, sitting on our conscious mind, exercising conscious control. What we don't know about is that there is a huge, very powerful subconscious, these automatic patterns of response, their skills and habits behind us influencing what we do. Now, both of these can influence behavior. It's just the subconscious is much more powerful, but we don't know about it. We only think that we exercise conscious control, so we don't really look for anything else. But the science shows quite clearly that we are biologically wired to respond according to our subconscious, and that works now, I guess, in the language of a sense of danger. It drives 95% of behavior. It's fast and it's low energy use. So for instance, if our sense of danger of doing something is low, we tend to do it. If our sense of danger is high, then we tend not to do it. Before our conscious assessment of risk, which drives 5% of behavior, it's low and it's high energy use. So if consciously assessing risk, and the reason why I'm sort of talking to you about risk is because so much of safety is tied to risk and conscious control. And the neuroscience is telling us that that's not the way that the brain works. So if consciously assessing risk really drove what we did, then less people would want to get in a car and no one would ever be afraid of getting on an aeroplane and flying. Now, from a risk perspective, flying on an aeroplane is infinitely safer than getting in a car. But there are more people that are afraid of getting in an aeroplane than actually driving in a car. So when we think about risk and we go, well, where did it come from? It's actually a construct for use by the conscious mind. It was invented by the Medici family in Florence in the 15th century in order for them to be able to assess what interest rates they were going to charge to people that they lent money to. Sense of danger has been with us for all our evolution. It's innate. It's part of who we are. Now, assigning risk is not a bad thing. It helps us plan and prioritize resources before we start something. That's when it's most useful. But we tend not to assess risk instinctively in the moment, and it's hard to get us to do so. That's the issue with risk. So we repeatedly favour using danger to warn people because it has more impact. So if you remember, stranger danger, it was never stranger risk. If you go anywhere near railways, it's always danger, moving trains. It's never risk, moving trains. And if you're the right vintage, you might even remember warning, danger, Will Robinson. It was never warning, risk, Will Robinson. So we've intuitively used danger because that's much more innate and we react much more to it than just talking to people about risk. So what our brain does very well is pattern match. So whenever we have an experience, the first thing the brain does is, what is this most like? Not what is it exactly like, what is it most like? And this happens often before an outcome, and our brain interprets what that is instinctively and assigns a brain mode for us to respond. Why? Is because it's used it in the past, it worked, and it's just assumed that it's going to work in the future. So although it feels like we're reacting to the world, our brain largely predicts, and it predicts based on the outcomes of previous experiences. The way we interpret our experiences can distort our sense of danger. For instance, our sense of danger can be heightened by being made aware of events with negative outcomes, even if it's very low risk. So I remember a few years back, we went to the beach a couple of weeks after there were a few shark attacks on the other side of the country, and my kids didn't want to go in the water. Their sense of danger was heightened. So happened. Our sense of danger can be lowered if we do something repeatedly without having a negative outcome, even if it's quite risky. And the classic example there is texting while driving. When you talk to people and you ask them, why do you text while driving? They tell you that they know it's risky, but what they also say is that I've done it thousands of times before and nothing bad's ever happened. And that's really your brain sort of using your previous experiences to predict what's going to happen in the future. So it's not about risk, it's about your sense of danger. And that, to me, is the modern day safety problem. And it's currently being ignored, and you can't fix it by just doing things outside the person or around the person. You've got to get in there and help the people see the world differently. So what we know from research is that the safer they feel, is it the more or the less attention they pay? Well, it's the less attention they pay. So the more we do around the person, the safer they would feel, and the safer they feel, the less attention they pay. So what the discoveries of neuroscience show is that doing things around the worker is not enough, and the way we have dealt with behaviour is inconsistent with how the brain actually works. It had some impacts, but it hasn't had as much impact given the time and effort that we put in that perhaps maybe it should. So most human behaviour is a battle for control between the two brain modes, as I mentioned to you before, but that's not everything. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about stress and fatigue. They're the two main disruptors. And what I mean by that is that once stress and fatigue come into play, it shuts down the autopilot and the conscious mind totally. And there's a different brain mode, a different way that the brain works in order to address what's going on around them. So what's going on in our brain when we're stressed? Well, there's a surge of adrenaline and cortisol, and that causes the conscious mind to be temporarily sidelined. And that's just a normal response to a threat or a challenge. So you're probably familiar with an MRI. Like I've got a dicky knee, I think that's the medical term. So I go to my GP and he sends me off to an MRI. He gets back a picture and he looks at it and he goes, Cristian, you've got fluid in your knee. This is what we've got to do. That's fine. You're probably not familiar with a functional MRI or an fMRI. That's not a picture. That actually maps blood flow as it happens. So if you map blood flow in the brain and you give it to a neuroscientist, he can work out exactly how the brain works. So think about this. For the first time in human history, we're able to see inside people's heads as it happens. It's a real game changer. And one of the things that we've discovered is a lot of the assumptions that we've made about how the brain works are probably incomplete, and some of them are totally incorrect. So let me give you an example. If I put your head into a functional MRI and I show you a picture of a snake, your amygdala lights up like a Christmas tree. Why? Well, because blood rushes there, because the amygdala is one of the places where we register threats. Now, the other interesting thing that happens is blood flow to the prefrontal cortex, this bit just here behind your forehead, where that's the bit that you use to regulate behaviour. Blood flow to that part of the brain diminishes. It diminishes to a point where there is enough blood for the brain cells to stay alive, but not enough blood in order for them to operate. Essentially, temporarily sidelining your conscious mind. So, and that is why when people feel threatened, they lash out and later they regret it. It's because they know it's not a good thing to do, but at the time they felt threatened, the prefrontal cortex wasn't fully online and therefore they weren't able to regulate their behavior. Now, from a safety perspective, the issue with stress, and whether that's rushing, frustration, impatience, anger, whatever it is that we get tunnel vision about the outcome, or we get obsessed with what gets in our way. And when we do that, that results in inattention. That's not about psychology. It's not about culture. That is human neurobiology at work. That is about being human, nothing else. Able to sideline our slow conscious mind has helped humans survive. So when a threat approached our ancestors in the wild, they would either fight, flight, or freeze. Now, those that thought consciously about it probably took too long and over a period of time perished. So that ability, or I guess that functionality of as soon as we get threatened, we either fight, flight, or freeze, ended up getting embedded into our genetics and DNA. So today, our brains still react in the same manner to threats, although most of the threats most of the things that threaten us tend to be on a social nature, not so many sort of tigers and other things. So when adrenaline or cortisol hits our brain, what happens is what we know and learned goes missing in action. If any of you have ever done any public speaking, but the first couple of minutes of public speaking is, that's when the adrenaline hits. And a lot of the times I tend to learn my lines off, until I know them automatically, because I know that that's coming. And you don't want to be in a situation when you forget something at the start, because that kind of puts you off for the rest of the presentation. So what happens is stress narrows our field of vision. Now, when we do this in front of a live audience, face-to-face, what we do is we actually get them to put their hands to the side and move them back until they can't see them anymore. For most people, you're going to be able to see 180, 190 degrees. After 190 degrees, if you move your hands any further back, you can't see them. So that's not within your field of vision. What we do know is that the minimum requirement, legal requirement to drive, is to have a field of vision of at least 110 degrees. When we're stressed, when we're rushing, frustrated, impatient, it can be as little as 40 to 45 degrees. So we find it difficult to see anything on either side of us. It's like we only see what's in front of us because we lose peripheral vision. And this has been confirmed with the incidents that we've done that involve rushing, frustration, and impatience. Hardly any of those are contact with things that are in front of the person. Most of those are contact with things that come from the side. So that's about stress. We'll come back and we'll talk about the solution for that in a minute. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk a little bit about fatigue and how that comes about. So if you see that picture of a man there, what you will see soon is there's little white dots will appear. So the reason why I want you to pay attention to those is firstly, because that's what's happening to you during the day. So as all cells in our body have to burn fuel with oxygen to generate energy, but there's also waste products. The lymphatic system takes the waste products away from our body, but it doesn't go into our brain. So there is some dissipation of that waste, but it accumulates over the day. The second reason why I want you to pay attention to those dots is because it took me a long time to get it to look like this, and I want you to really appreciate it. So the brain generates waste products, adenosine or adenosine triphosphate, if you know any biology, ATP, and those waste products get in between the brain cells and stop the communication. Now, ATP builds up during the day, clogs our conscious mind and other neural circuits, and that results in brain fog. Now, sleep cleans our brain. So because the lymphatic system doesn't really work in our brain, what happens at night, it's called the glymphatic system, we use glial cells to every 90 minutes or so to flush the brain. So typically what gets recommended is about 7.5 hours of sleep. That's 5 cycles. If you get 5 cleaning cycles during the night, you wake up with a clean brain, you feel alert, and you feel ready to go. If you've only had 2 or 3 cycles, you're going to feel a little bit lethargic. That's why, because most of the cleaning of the brain happens when we're asleep. So when we're fatigued, our brain is shutting down to conserve energy. What happens is our ability to think fades away, so it fades quickly, our reflexes get slower, and paying attention becomes much harder. Once we feel tired, our brain is mush, and we make poor in-the-moment decisions without even knowing about it, because most of the time when we make a poor in-the-moment decision, we get away with it. So if we try to understand how fatigue comes about, and we were to plot the level of fatigue as a function of time of day, if we have a good night's sleep and we wake up nice and alert, there's no fatigue, but it gets to a certain point during the day where that accumulation of ATP sort of catches up with us, and fatigue starts to set in. That usually lasts for 20 to 30 minutes, and then the fatigue has set in, and that's the tired zone. So at number 2 is when we start to feel tired, but we've actually been under the influence of fatigue, now our brain not working that well, since where number 1 is. So a couple of questions for you. At which point, 1 or 2, are we in the best position to decide how to manage fatigue? Well, obviously, number 1, because you're catching it earlier, your brain's working better, so you're going to be able to make a better decision. The second question is, at which point, 1 or 2, do most people decide? And of course, most people decide at point number 2 because they don't really worry about fatigue until they feel tired. Problem is that once you feel tired, your brain is mush and you're not going to make a good decision. So that's the bit about fatigue. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how the brain functions in general, and then we'll go back and we'll look at the solutions for the neuroscience solutions for stress and for fatigue. So our brain assigns a brain mode to deal with what we experience based on how it interprets it. So the question the brain asks is, whatever experience it's having is, what is this most like? Not what is it exactly like, what is this most like? Now, if it comes up with nothing, then it's obviously something new or different. And under that scenario, we want to keep conscious control because we want to focus and think about how we need to respond. Sometimes it's familiar or it's close to being familiar. Under that scenario, it's a question of complacency or autopilot, and we tend to use inattentive habits. If we're short of time or something's in our way, then that's about stress, rushing, frustration, impatience, that kind of stuff. And we tend to take shortcuts. And if we're low on energy, then that's a fatigue issue, and we tend to make poor in-the-moment decisions. So what the brain does is at first it interprets what the experience is. Now, that interpretation has been measured. It happens in less than 20 milliseconds. That is 1/50th of a second. And it happens without our knowledge, awareness, or permission. Now, once it interprets, it assigns a brain mode. And once it assigns a brain mode, then we basically get a certain functionality. If you like, the brain gets prepared to work in a certain way. What we do know is that 95% of what we do is driven by the subconscious, because most of what we do tends to be familiar. And there are times when we're short of time or something's in our way or we're low on energy. So when the subconscious drives what we do, conscious control drops off naturally. Because like I said before, only one brain mode can be in control of behavior, resulting in increased inattention and more safety incidents. So if we look at the mechanics of how brains actually work, we have a processing unit, the conscious mind, the prefrontal cortex, and that's the bit behind the forehead here. And we've also got an inputs generator. That's the subconscious mind and the limbic system. Now, if we look at behavior as the output, we'll look at the end and then work backwards. What does it look like? So what we know from the neuroscience is that the last step before behavior is conscious processing. So from the time we become aware that we're going to do something to the time that we actually do it, it's a very, very short time. So that's why everything feels conscious. But what we know from the neuroscience is that the conscious mind tends to process what the subconscious feeds it. And the subconscious feeds it a response from these automatic patterns that are based from the outcomes of previous experiences. So what neuroscience shows is that although it feels like we have conscious control over what we do every day, that's not what's happening in our brain. So how does this kind of work when we're short of time or something's in our way? So what we do know is that the conscious mind has been temporarily sidelined. We're not really able to regulate our behavior particularly well. And once the brain interprets something as we're short of time or something's in our way, there's an automatic pattern that gets generated. There's a response. That response is usually a shortcut. Now, consciously, we know that taking shortcuts doesn't make any sense. It's not good to do that. But because the conscious mind is offline or has been sidelined, we don't regulate that behavior and it goes straight through. And that's how stress comes about. Rushing, frustration, fatigue, that's how the brain sort of deals with it. So although many things can get us stressed, these are the more common ones that people tell us about when we do our training. You know, partner, work, boss, family member, traffic, equipment, computers, idiots. I don't know what that means, but people seem to write that down a fair bit whenever we ask them the question. So all these things can get us stressed. And, you know, rushing, impatience, frustration, even anger, if it's extreme enough. So what starts it and how much it affects us is different for each of us. However, the solution is much the same for most people. The problem with not dealing with stress in the moment is that cortisol stays in our system for over 60 minutes. And if we allow it to do that, during that time, we're going to be more inattentive and we're going to increase the chances of getting hurt. Now, what we teach people to do is how to deal with it as soon as possible, because if we get people to deal with it as soon as possible, cortisol can dissipate within a few minutes. How do we deal with stress? Essentially, it's trying to get people to go from an inattentive hothead with a very narrow focus to a more attentive cooler head with a wider focus. And the way we do that is we help people recognize when they're stressed and we get them to slow down and calm down. But knowing what to do is one thing. Doing it when it counts is quite another. And one of the things that I sort of mentioned to people is, look, is when we talk about, you know, rushing and frustration and other things, people are very good at telling me why they're rushing or why they're frustrated or why they're impatient. And what I say to them is, I don't care why. What I care about is that you can recognize it and slow and calm down as soon as possible. So in order to be able to recognize it and slow and calm down as soon as possible, knowing is not enough. Just because you know does not mean you're going to make the right conscious decision when it counts. You have to wire it in. And one of the things that we do as part of the training is set up a system in order for people to be able to wire that in so that progressively they get better at recognizing it and doing something about it. So what happens when we're low on energy? So there's an automatic pattern, right? And what your brain knows is that you need some sleep. And it also knows that the best sleep you're going to get is in your own bed. So sometimes it makes a decision of getting in your car and driving home. Now, we all know that driving when you're fatigued is not a good idea, right? But I'm pretty sure that everybody that I've ever known has done it at least once. I know that I certainly have. And once you make that intuitive poor decision, because your brain is clogged up, your prefrontal cortex that regulates behavior is not working particularly well, it allows that poor decision to become behavior. And that's really how the brain sort of deals with fatigue. So although there are many early warning signs of fatigue, and I'm just going to specifically talk about on the road, because that tends to be where most people can have a potentially negative, severe negative consequence due to fatigue. The early warning signs that people tell us about is you hit rumble strips, late or no indicator, miss exit signs, mixed signs or exits, leave high beams on when traffic's coming the other way, you miss turn-offs, brake too early or too late, or you take corners too sharp or not sharp enough. All those things are early warning signs of fatigue. The interesting thing is that the early warning signs of fatigue that are easy to notice, they're different for each of us, but the solution is much the same for most people. So the problem with fatigue is that people wait until they feel tired to deal with it. And by that time, their brain is mush and they make a poor in the moment decision, which they get away with most of the time. So in order to deal with fatigue, we need to get people to go from a poor in the moment decisions when our brain is mush, when we feel tired, to a safer in the moment decision when our brain is working better, typically 30 minutes earlier. And in order to do it 30 minutes earlier, you have to be able to notice the early warning signs. Because once you notice the early warning signs, you can do something about the fatigue because you know it's coming before feeling tired. So knowing is one thing, getting it done when it counts reliably is quite another. So a lot of the training that we provide is about not just getting people to know the two-step process, it's about getting them to practice it in a way that it becomes more automatic and they don't have to consciously think about it. Because just because they know doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to make the right decision. So thinking we can keep people safe by only doing things around them gives the illusion of control. Because we can control some things, but not all. I mean, we can control more things at work than outside, but I'm interested in safety 24/7, and we can't control everything anywhere. There is an increasing trend of incidents, even serious ones, with things that are meant to be there. So what we've noticed over the last 15 years is an increase of incident investigations where incidents happen where people come into contact with things that are meant to be there. So running into poles, tripping over gutters, running into doors, all that kind of stuff, some of which are quite serious. And also sort of falls when it comes to sort of people using stairs. So the last few incident investigations that we did were falls on stairs. And I can tell you one thing, the stairs complied with the Australian standard and they had the anti-slip strips as well. They weren't worn or anything. Yet people still had an incident and even one of them sort of got pretty badly hurt. I think it was their back. So what we found is that 95% of incidents happen to people while their subconscious brain modes are in play. And what we hear a lot is that the environment drives behavior. And that is true, but it's also misleading because when people say the environment drives behavior, considering the external environment. So the surroundings generates a situation around the person. And that certainly happens. What you never hear about is the internal environment. And that is the person's brain interpreting a situation and assigning a brain mode to deal with it. Now, if it assigns a subconscious brain mode, you're also going to get avoidable inattention. And that brain mode determines the behavior of the person. So, because the person needs to respond according to the brain functionality in play. Now, we're certainly able to change that one, and anything we do in order not to entice people to get into a subconscious brain mode is a good thing, but we can't always control the environment around us. The good news is that we're also able to change that one. And people ask me, they go, well, which one's better? Is it the external or the internal? And my answer is that why is it just one or the other? Why can't we do both? Anything we do for safety is good. Now, what our clients have told us is that the advantage of also doing the internal environment is that once that's changed, people carry it with them everywhere. So it comes to their rescue when the external environment is not perfect. But at the moment in safety, that one seems to be taboo. People say, oh, you can't do that. Well, I disagree. I know that you can do that. And it's not that difficult, but you have to put in a bit of time and effort in order to wire or rewire people's brains. So if we don't help people change their internal environment, we lock out our most valuable asset from the opportunity to be in more control of their own safety. Because we're not always going to be able to do something around them to keep them safe. So Human Nature 101, the more we do for them, the more or the less they do for themselves. The less they do for themselves. So rather than just doing more for them, just doing things around them, I think it kind of makes sense to do things around them, but also to do things with them, get them engaged in the process of change. All right, so let's look at a case study. Why do people rush? Well, because that is our most common automatic pattern of response when we are short of time. Right. Now, I've mentioned the more common causes before, in a previous slide. Just to give you an example of this, so my wife never speeds. She's a very calm driver. But what I have noticed is that she becomes, she speeds a lot and drives a lot more erratically whenever she's driving me to the airport and we're running late. Now, what I've also noticed is that on the days that I'm leaving, she's a little bit happier. And I'm really confused about that. It's a real mystery. I'm not sure why that is. But the point that I'm trying to make is that under certain circumstances, certain people will opt to rush or will engage their brain in a way that will make them rush. So everyone knows rushing causes mistakes, haste makes waste, but rather than focusing to learn to deal with it, most people offer reasons for why they were rushing in the first place. And what I say to them is, look, I don't really care why you were rushing. What I'm interested in is that you can recognize it and slow yourself down so you don't have an incident, you don't make mistakes. If there's an incident at work that involved rushing, what's the most common reason given? Now, I mentioned that study that we did of over 200 incidents. I can tell you that 65% of those incidents involved rushing. So we've heard this answer about 130 times, and it's pretty consistent. My supervisor made me rush. Now, in my experience, the vast majority of supervisors are not trying to make people rush. Why? Because rushing causes mistakes. What we found was that people's interpretation of a neutral situation to be the main driver. I mean, some people have even said to me, the only time I ever rush is when my supervisor is holding a gun to my head, metaphorically speaking, of course. And of course, I always say to them, so have you ever gone over the speed limit? They go, yeah. And then I ask them, have you ever received documented proof in the mail that you've gone over the speed limit? They smile and they go, yeah. They go, was your supervisor next to you holding a gun to your head on those days? Of course not. So, you know, the thing for me is that we have to get people to realize that they have more control over what they do than they realize. But people are really good at blaming someone or something when they rush or when something happens around them. What does blaming do for them? Well, makes them feel better, right? But doesn't help them prevent it from happening again or having an incident and getting hurt. So what we say to people is that if you want to blame, go ahead, but also look at it from your own perspective. Is there anything that you can do? Is there anything you can get better at so that it doesn't happen next time or it happens less often? Now, people blame someone or something for making them rush, even though they don't have much control over them. In my view, expecting others to always do the right thing by us is going to disappoint, right? Because the world does not adapt to what we need. We forget that supervisors and other leaders are people too, and they have bad days. So on bad days, they may say things in a way that could be interpreted as, or he or she wants me to rush. But I've never heard, not even once, of someone losing their job because, or being disciplined because they refuse to rush. Now, most of the incidents that involved rushing in our study, there was little or no pressure from the supervisor or anybody else. In fact, it was common for the supervisors to randomly and frequently remind people that they didn't want them to rush because rush led to mistakes. So controlling what happens around the worker to avoid rushing can help. So our view is, yep, we need to do some of that, and certainly in our training we do, but it's not fail-safe and does not prevent incidents where the worker interpret a need to rush. And that's the issue. So being able to deal with rushing in the moment gives people an extra layer of protection independent of what happens around them that most other people just don't have. And that layer of protection can be the difference between a glancing blow and a direct hit. So when we do our training, we certainly do training in order to teach the worker how to deal with complacency, stress and fatigue, part of which is dealing with rushing. But we also teach leaders, including supervisors, how rushing comes about and what they can do not to entice people to get into those states of mind. So a common form of rushing, multitasking. Now, when we think we're doing two things at once, we're actually switching between them. Now, I've got to be honest with you about this. Women are much better at this than men. But just because they're much better at it doesn't mean that they make less mistakes. The interesting thing from a neuroscience perspective is that in order to go from one to the other, we have to shut down one neural circuit and start up another one. And that increases our cognitive load. So we can't pay the same level of attention to things when that happens. And there's actually something a little bit more interesting as well. And I'll share the research on this. So what they did here is that they put people in a simulator for driving, and they just said, you drive. Now things appeared in front of them, and what they did is they measured their reaction time. Their reaction time was 430 milliseconds, so almost half a second. Then what they got them to do is they got them to get on their phone and have a conversation with somebody. It was just a chit chat. What they found was that their reaction time doubled. So if you extrapolate that curve up there, it was about 900 milliseconds, almost a second. So it went from half a second to almost a second. And the other interesting thing that they found is once they got people to put the phone down, it took them 30 seconds to get back to a reaction time of 430 milliseconds. So we think that as soon as we put the phone down, we instantaneously go from not paying attention to driving as much as we could to all of a sudden paying 100% attention. That's not what happens. It takes 30 seconds to shut down one neural circuit and start up another one. So for that 30 seconds, your reaction time is slower than what it could be. And if during those 30 seconds something unexpected happens, you may not have enough reaction time in order to avoid it. So if we want to improve safety performance, We can do all the stuff around the worker, and that's a good thing, but we also need to teach people to control their subconscious brain modes, because if we don't, we're allowing the subconscious brain modes to control them. It controls you and it controls me if we don't know how to deal with them. So the issue for me is that in safety, we have fallen in love with the out-of-date view that knowledge, conscious control, and doing things around the worker is all we need to keep people safe. We actually need more. To improve safety performance, we need more. We keep doing same old under a different label, expecting a different result. Now, isn't that the definition of insanity? It's like we're taking exactly the same medicine out of a different bottle, and all of a sudden we expect it to work. What do we need? Well, the first thing we need is to improve our ability to influence. Show care, build trust, be inclusive, psychological safety, all those things improve our ability to influence. And they are good to do, but by themselves, it's a panacea of wishful thinking. It does very little. How do we know? Well, because there's plenty of data that shows avoidable inattention. Inattention trumps all of those. If we look at the cause of accidental deaths in ages 1 to 14, the main cause is that they're getting run over. Where are they getting run over most often? In their own driveways. Who's running them over? People that care about them and people that they trust. So care and trust, they're good things to have, but inattention trumps them. We also need, and it's good because care and trust gives you additional information you can work with, but it's about what you do with that information. We also need to address the areas that impact safety. And for the last 50 years, it's been eliminate hazards, fix controls, and get people to think more about safety. Now, of late, the conscious control, think more about safety, isn't really all that popular. So what's popular is doing things around the worker. Now, so it's about sort of doing that. The problem with that is that we've got something missing. And what we're missing, or the answer of what we're missing, is brought to us by neuroscience. We've also got to deal with the main drivers of human behavior. And the main driver of human behavior is those subconscious brain modes. So for us, it's about doing all of it, not just one or two. And we know that good safety leaders address all the areas that impact safety, not just the ones that they feel comfortable with. If we're serious about safety, it makes sense to use everything at our disposal. We need to do things around the person, but if we're going to do something with the person, we need a whole of brain approach. We need to address the conscious as well as the subconscious. But helping people deal with the subconscious brain modes is not do it yourself. It needs a new set of skills that most people just don't have. And there's two parts to this. Some new knowledge and a bit of conscious control at first. And a lot of the times, management and safety professionals tend to think that if we give people knowledge, they will make the right conscious decision when it matters. I wish that was true, but unfortunately, the brain doesn't work like that. So the second part of it, and the more challenging part of it, is an ongoing process that continually rewires the subconscious to be automatically safer. Because unless it gets done automatically, it's not going to come into play reliably, and it's not going to come into play in a way that it rescues a person from having an incident. Now, when we do our training, the way we describe this is that we say to people, look, knowing you need to exercise doesn't make you fit. Actually doing the exercises makes you fit. But if you make a habit of doing the exercises, then staying fit is a lot easier. And when you don't do it, it kind of feels weird, because that's the way that habits work. If you're doing something habitual and today you're not doing it, it kind of feels weird and uncomfortable. So what we've done is we've used the discoveries of neuroscience to design an efficient and effective process to do just that. Provide the knowledge, bit of conscious control at first, but more importantly is what's the ongoing process in order to embed this in people's heads. And the reason why we've chosen neuroscience is because it's the only discipline we know of that really understands what's going on inside people's heads. all the other disciplines are having a guess from the outside in. Neuroscience measure what's going on the inside. So look, if you're interested in this, I've written a book. It's available from our website. You can also buy it electronically from Kobo. You've got my contact details there. There are some half a dozen podcasts about the kind of things we've spoken about over the last 3 webinars. It's available from a website as well as Spotify and wherever else you get them. I'm on LinkedIn. If you want to connect, by all means, sort of send me an invite. I'm more than happy to do that. And the next thing that we've got planned is Tuesday next week, where we've got a Q&A session for anything that comes up that tickles your fancy over the 3 webinars. If you send Christina an email with an answer, with a question, we'll try and do our best to answer it for you. Now, Christina, I'll get back to you.
Thank you so much, Cristian. I kept asking people in the chat to ask questions, and they pretty much told me to shut up. They're too busy listening. So thank you so much. I exactly like what Jane has just said, fascinating and so interesting. I completely agree. I'm so very excited for Tuesday. So like Cristian has just said, if you have any questions, I've popped my email address in the chat box up the top. So please get in touch. I'll also, even if you wanted to screenshot this slide here and reach out to Cristian as well, I'll also email out a copy of this after today's session. That will probably be tomorrow. So as well as the registration link to join us on Tuesday. Cristian, again, thank you so much. And I can't wait to hopefully see you all again on Tuesday. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.